Imagine you're standing in a tribe 15,000 years ago. Nobody has a wedding ring. Nobody has a marriage certificate. Nobody has ever heard the phrase, "till death do us part." There isn't even a word for husband or wife. And yet somewhere in this tribe, two people have started doing something incredibly strange. They're staying together, not for a few weeks, not for a season, not until somebody more attractive shows up from the next valley over. They're staying together for years, maybe even for life, which raises a surprisingly difficult question. Why? Because marriage is weird, really weird. Think about it. Nobody invented sleeping. Nobody invented eating. Nobody invented breathing. But marriage had to come from somewhere. Somebody, at some point, looked at the chaotic mess of human reproduction and said, you know what this needs? Rules. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We don't actually know when that happened. We don't know where. We don't know who invented it, and we're not entirely sure why. But here's what we do know. The real reason marriage was invented has almost nothing to do with love, and everything to do with goats. We'll get there. Let's start with something nobody tells you in school. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, there was probably no marriage at all, not in any form you'd recognize. And before you picture some romantic pre-civilization paradise, let me stop you, because it was not that. Go back 2 to 3 million years. Your earliest ancestors, the Australopithecines, were living in a system that looked like this. Dominant males competed violently for access to females. One, if they were big enough, and the smaller males basically just hoped for the best. We know this from bones. Early hominin males were significantly larger than females. Not slightly, significantly. And in the animal kingdom, that specific size gap is one of the clearest signals of one specific social arrangement. Competition. Think gorillas. Male gorillas are nearly twice the size of females. Male gorillas also maintain harems. They do not share. They do not compromise. They do not have a conversation about their feelings. Your ancestors weren't that extreme, but they were closer to gorillas than to a wedding reception. Now here's the first mystery. At some point, that changed. Modern human males are only about 15 to 20% larger than females. That gap narrowed dramatically over hundreds of thousands of years. And when the size gap narrows, it means the intensity of male competition is declining. Something was replacing fighting as the dominant reproductive strategy. Something more interesting. But what? Here's where the brain enters the story, as it always does with humans. Human babies are, from a biological standpoint, an absolute disaster. A baby giraffe drops 2 meters to the ground at birth, lands, and starts walking within an hour. A baby horse is trotting in under 2 hours. Even chimpanzee infants can cling to their mother almost immediately. A human newborn cannot hold its own head up for months. This isn't a flaw in the design. It's actually a very specific evolutionary trade-off. Human brains grew so large that if they fully developed inside the womb, the skull would be too big to fit through the birth canal. So evolution did something clever and slightly horrifying. It made us give birth early. Human babies are, by design, born premature. At birth, your brain is only 25% of its adult size, which means that an enormous amount of human development, the stuff that takes other animals weeks, takes us years. Years of complete helplessness. Years during which a mother investing everything in one infant is extraordinarily vulnerable. She needs food. She needs protection. She needs someone to bring back meat while she's nursing. And here's where the evolutionary math starts to change. A male who stays, who helps, who invests in a specific female, and her offspring produces more surviving children than a male who wanders off after mating. From a purely biological standpoint, loyalty started to pay. This is when the attachment systems in the human brain started to really matter. Oxytocin, vasopressin, dopamine, the neurochemical infrastructure of what we call love. Not a modern invention. Ancient machinery built over millions of years, designed to make you want to stay. Prairie voles form lifelong monogamous pairs. Their brains are loaded with vasopressin receptors. Their close cousins, the montane voles, are promiscuous. Fewer receptors, different brain, different behavior. The biology of attachment is real. It's old. It was running in your ancestors long before anyone had a word for marriage. But here's the problem. Having a biological tendency to bond with someone is completely different from inventing an institution. Wolves bond for life. Wolves don't have wedding ceremonies. So what took the biological tendency and turned it into a social institution with rules, contracts, ceremonies, and lawyers? For that, we need to talk about what changed everything. Agriculture. 12,000 years ago, humans started farming, and farming created something that had never really existed before. Stuff, stored grain, domesticated animals, land that produced reliable harvests year after year. For the first time in human history, there was something genuinely worth owning. And here's the thing about owning stuff. At some point, you die. And when you die, your stuff has to go somewhere. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, people people needed to answer a question that had never mattered before. Whose children are those? A woman always knows which children are hers. She was there. A man has to trust. And trust, as anyone who's ever watched a daytime talk show knows, has limits. So if you're a Neolithic farmer who spent 20 years clearing land, breeding animals, and building a grain store, you need to know that the children you're leaving it to are actually yours, not your neighbor's, not the guy from the next village who came through in spring, yours. And the solution ancient humans invented for this problem was marriage. Formal, socially enforced, publicly announced marriage. Not because they loved each other, not because they wanted to grow old together, but because someone needed to watch the goats and someone needed to confirm whose goats they were eventually going to be. That's it. That's the invention of marriage, and you thought it was about romance. The oldest formal marriage contracts ever found come from ancient Mesopotamia, 4,000 years old, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, and they read exactly like what they are. Property contracts. They list the assets being transferred. They specify penalties for dissolution. They outline the legal obligations of both parties. If you replace the names, formatted it slightly differently, and changed grain store to stock portfolio, it would look like something a divorce lawyer hands you today. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BCE, spells it out even more bluntly. Detailed clauses about the consequences of female adultery, the rights of a man to reclaim a wife, the conditions under which a marriage could be dissolved. Female adultery specifically, not male adultery. The document barely mentions it, because male adultery didn't create the problem marriage was designed to solve. Female adultery did. Female adultery meant you might be raising someone else's children and handing them your grain store. This is uncomfortable to read, but it's what the documents literally say. And here's the thing nobody talks about. This wasn't considered monstrous at the time. It was considered sensible accounting. Marriage wasn't about your feelings. It was about your estate, which raises the obvious next question. If marriage started as a property contract, when did it become about love? The answer is much more recent than you think, and what caused the shift is completely unexpected. Let's talk about what marriage actually looked like across different civilizations, because it was almost nothing like what most people picture. Ancient Egypt, where we always end up because the Egyptians did everything first, had a surprisingly modern approach. There was no formal ceremony required, no priest, no state registration. If a man and woman set up a household together and the community recognized them as a couple, they were married. Done. That's it. Divorce was accessible for both parties. Egyptian women could own property, conduct business, and appear in court. A woman leaving a marriage took her own property with her. By ancient standards, this was basically progressive feminism. Ancient Rome is more interesting and considerably messier. Early Roman marriage was called manus marriage. A woman passed entirely from her father's legal control to her husband's. She became his legal dependent. Same category as his children, she owned nothing in her own name. But by the later Republic, Rome had largely replaced this with something called free marriage. And free marriage is almost shockingly modern. Under free marriage, a Roman woman remained under her father's authority, not her husband's. She owned her own property. Her husband had no legal claim to her assets, and Roman divorce was astonishingly simple. No court, no proceeding, no lawyer. If either party stopped consenting to the marriage was over. Wealthier Romans changed spouses with a frequency that would make a modern tabloid editor very, very happy. So here's the question you should be asking. If ancient Rome had relatively progressive marriage law by modern standards, why did things get more restrictive afterward? Why did the rules get tighter, the punishments harsher, the exit harder? One word, the church. Most people assume Christianity and marriage have always been deeply intertwined, that the church invented the wedding ceremony, that religious marriage is the original marriage. This is almost entirely wrong. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the church didn't run marriage at all. Early Christians got married the same way their pagan neighbors did. Local customs, family agreements, Roman legal forms were applicable. Marriage was a private matter, not a sacrament. The church wasn't involved. 1,200 years after Jesus, that's when the Catholic Church first formally declared marriage one of the 7 sacraments. And it wasn't until 1563 at the Council of Trent that the church mandated formal religious ceremonies, public announcements, and a priest's presence as requirements for a valid marriage. For context, that's 1,500 years after Christianity began before the church fully took ownership of weddings. So why then? Power. If only church-sanctioned marriages were valid, then only the church could determine the legitimacy of children, the legitimacy of inheritance, the legitimacy of kings. A pope who could declare your marriage invalid could declare your throne empty. This wasn't subtle. Entire wars were fought over it. Henry VIII wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. The Pope said no. Henry VIII said, fine, I'll start my own church. He did. The entire Protestant Reformation in England, one of the most significant religious ruptures in Western history, started with one man not wanting wanting to stay married. That is how much power ran through this institution. And while all of this was happening at the top, something completely different was happening in the daily lives of ordinary people across the world, because there's something the history books almost never mention. For most of human history and most cultures, the specific form of marriage we consider completely normal, the one man, one woman, till death do us part arrangement, it was actually the minority. Here's a statistic that tends to stop people cold. Roughly 80 to 85% of all documented human societies in the anthropological record practiced or permitted polygyny. One man, multiple wives, not as a fringe arrangement, as the social norm for men of means. Ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, ancient India, pre-colonial Africa, pre-Columbian Americas, the Islamic world from the 7th century onward, which formally permitted up to 4 wives. Even the foundational figures of the 3 major monotheistic religions, Abraham, multiple wives, David, multiple wives, and concubines, Solomon, 700 wives and 300 concubines, which logistically raises so many questions. The Hebrew Bible does not treat this as scandalous. It treats it as a completely normal thing for a wealthy and powerful man to do. Strict one man, one woman marriage enforced by law and culture is largely a Roman legal invention, reinforced by the Christian church and then exported globally through colonization, which means the form of marriage most people in the modern West consider simply natural, simply human, simply obvious, is a specific regional and historical arrangement that achieved global dominance through very specific political and religious forces over roughly 2,000 years. It is not the human default. It is one answer to the question. There have been many others. Now, here's the part of the story that genuinely surprises people. The idea that you should marry someone you're in love with, that's new, radically new. For most of human history, across most cultures, marriages were arranged, negotiated between families. The individual feelings of the people actually getting married were, at best, a secondary consideration. In ancient China, marriages were negotiated through professional matchmakers. The concept of marrying someone you had feelings for was considered naive at best, socially disruptive at worst. You married who your family chose because your family's interests were larger than your personal emotions, and everyone accepted this as simple social fact. In medieval Europe, aristocratic marriages were diplomatic instruments. When a king's daughter married a neighboring duke's son, it wasn't a love story. It was a peace treaty, signed in flowers and vows and an enormous feast. The idea that personal romantic feeling should be the primary basis for marriage, that your heart should make this decision rather than your father's business interests, roughly 200 to 250 years old. 200 years out of 300,000 years of human existence. You are living inside one of the shortest and strangest experiments in the entire history of human relationships. The love marriage, the idea that you go find someone who makes you feel something and you build your life around that feeling, and that feeling will sustain both of you for decades. And here's what nobody tells you about that experiment. It came with a massive side effect. Divorce rates went up everywhere it spread, not because people suddenly became worse at commitment, but because an institution originally designed to transfer property and produce heirs was now being asked to deliver lifelong romantic fulfillment. Those are very different jobs. The property transfer job is mostly complete once you sign the paperwork. The romantic fulfillment job requires constant daily maintenance for 50 years. Marriage didn't fail. The job description changed completely without anyone updating the contract. Let's talk about ceremony, because this is the part that actually bridges everything. Across all of these radically different cultures with completely different rules and structures and legal arrangements, one thing appears nearly everywhere. The public announcement, the gathering of witnesses, the shared meal, the ritual that says to the entire community, these two people are now a unit. Why? In societies without written records, ceremonies were how you wrote to the community's memory. The feast wasn't optional. The celebration wasn't decorative. It was the mechanism by which the marriage became real. You weren't just declaring to each other. You were declaring to everyone, and everyone's presence was their confirmation that they'd update their model of the world to include this new unit, that they'd acknowledge it, respect it, act accordingly. The legal document came much later. The ceremony was the law. This is also why the specific details of ceremony became so culturally loaded. The white dress, which most people assume is ancient tradition, was popularized by Queen Victoria in 1840. Before that, brides wore their best dress, whatever color it happened to be. The white wedding dress as global symbol is less than 200 years old. You have probably attended or seen multiple weddings shaped more by Queen Victoria's fashion preferences than by any ancient human tradition. And yet the ceremony itself, in some form, In every culture, everywhere, every time, that part is genuinely ancient. Some needs don't change, even when the packaging does. Here's where we bring this all the way back. Marriage rates in most wealthy countries are declining. The average age of first marriage is rising everywhere. More people are remaining unmarried throughout their lives than at any point in recent recorded history. This gets framed as collapse, as the end of something fundamental, as a symptom of social breakdown. But here's the other way to read it. Marriage was invented to solve specific problems. Paternity certainty, property transfer, economic partnership in an era when the household was a unit of production. Alliance formation between families who needed each other for survival. In 2025, courts can establish paternity with a DNA test. Women can own property in most countries. The state provides social safety nets. Romantic partnership doesn't require legal formalization. The specific problems marriage was invented to solve have, for many people, largely been solved by other means, which means what marriage is actually competing for now is different. It's not competing as the only way to solve a property problem. It's competing as an answer to the oldest human problem, loneliness. For a deeply social species that evolved in tribes, in extended families, in communities where you were surrounded by people who knew you from birth, the modern world is a deeply strange place. Small apartments, geographic mobility, neighbors you've never met, coworkers you see for years without ever really knowing. Marriage became the last reliable container for human belonging. The one person who was supposed to know you completely. The one person you could fall apart in front of. The one person whose loyalty was publicly and legally and socially declared. That's an extraordinary amount of weight for one person. It was never supposed to work this way. For most of human history, that weight was distributed across a whole village. Marriage was one bond among many, not the only one that mattered. We took one thread from a much larger net and we asked it to hold everything. That's not marriage failing. That's us forgetting what we built it with. So, when did humans start getting married? Probably around the time they started farming. Why? Goats, grain, the problem of who gets what when you die. When did it become about love? About 200 years ago, in a cultural revolution that was genuinely new and genuinely strange, and produced both the most romantic institution in human history and the highest divorce rates ever recorded. What is it actually for? Probably what it has always been for. Underneath all the property law and religious ritual and romantic poetry, the unbearable weight of being a person alone in the world, the ancient, apparently unkillable human need to look at one other person and say, you. I choose you. Not because the law says so, not because my father negotiated it, not because I need someone to watch the goats, just you. The paperwork is recent, the desire is ancient, and somewhere 15,000 years ago, in a tribe where nobody had a word for husband or wife, two people made that choice anyway, before there were rings, before there were vows, before there was even a word for what they were doing. They just stayed, and that, it turns out, was the whole idea. So, if marriage had looked like an actual property contract when it was invented, with the full paperwork and penalties spelled out, do you think people would have gone through with it? Let me know in the comments. See you next time.